snowy on this snowy, icy evening. And we want to extend a special thanks to our guests, many of whom have traveled a long way to get here. My name is Ann Worley. I am the clerk of the Peace Committee here at Sandy Springs. Our Peace Committee members are John Salzberg, who was the mastermind in this event, Nick Mason, Ellen Atkinson, Peter Richmond, and our co-op member, Michael Conklin. And tonight we are excited to present to you this multi-faith peace panel entitled, "What Comes Next for Palestinians and Israelis?" Now, I've mentioned this to a few people, but months ago, when we started planning this event, John Salzberg told me the people he was going to invite and mentioned their credentials. And I said, John, be realistic. You'll never get all these 4 prominent people together in one place at one time and here at Sandy Spring, friends. Well, I was wrong and we lucked out. And tonight we are blessed to have these four speakers with us tonight. They come from a diversity of faiths, and as a result, you may hear a diversity of opinions, yet they all have ties to the Middle East, and they are all outspoken voices for peace and justice in the Middle East, as well as in the wider world. Of course, we understand that the Middle East conflict is a controversial topic. We, as Quakers, believe that all persons carry the light of the Spirit within them. And one way we nurture this light is by attentive and thoughtful listening. It's actually in our peace testimony. So even though you may not agree with everything that is said, we kindly ask that you keep your comments and questions respectful. And just a few housekeeping tips. Please silence your cell phones and please wait to ask questions after all the speakers have spoken. And now I'll hand it over to John to introduce our speakers.
I'm not using that. Thank you, Ann. I think that was very helpful to begin the program. The program will consist of the following. We have 4 speakers, and they will make an opening statement of up to 12 minutes in length. When they reach 10 minutes, which will, and then let them know that they have 2 more minutes. And then we will take questions from you, those of you here in the Lyceum. And Nick Mason has kindly offered to field the questions. I will call on people by name if I know who it is, or by motion. And Nick will take the mic to the questioner. You don't have to be up here, wherever you are. through the amazing work of Ron Lord and our technology, it'll be heard by everybody, including everybody on Zoom. And they will be able to see you on Zoom too. And then after a period of time, we will invite people on Zoom to ask questions. And Ron Lord will take care of they will have to signal that they want to ask a question, and then they will be called on. And we expect the meeting we won't have resolved all the problems, but we will try to adjourn by 9 o'clock. But I'm sure our speakers, if you have individual questions that haven't been asked, they will be available after the meeting is adjourned. And at the very end, I will invite the speakers to briefly give whatever concluding remarks they feel moved to make. So I'm going to introduce all 4 speakers now, and then we'll proceed. Our first speaker will be Philip Farah, a Palestinian American Christian, born and raised in Jerusalem. And at the age of 27, he emigrated to the United States. And he was a founding member of an organization I was associated with, the Washington Interfaith Alliance for Middle East Peace, as was Shelley, Fudge. And he's a co-founder of Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace. And perhaps in the course of his remarks, he'll tell you a little bit about that. And then our second speaker is Laila El-Haddad. She's a Palestinian American Muslim from Gaza. She was a journalist for Al Jazeera in Gaza from 2003 to 2007. And she was at that point raising a young child. I read about it in her book, which is called Gaza Mom, Palestine, Politics, Parenting, and Everything in Between. And she's also written a book on Gaza kitchen, Gaza food. That's a little far afield from what we're talking about today, but I'm sure she'd be happy to tell you about it. Then our third speaker is Shelley Cohen Fudge. She's a founder and a member of the Leadership Steering Committee, member of Jewish Voice for Peace in the Washington, D.C. Metro. And she is Jewish. She has relatives who live in Israel, and she grew up in Western North Carolina. Finally, last but not least, by any means, Steve Chase, who's a member of Friends Meeting of Washington, meeting of which I was a member for some years. He's also a member of the Quaker Palestine Israel Network. And he's an author of a Pendle Hill pamphlet, Pendle Hill being a Quaker retreat center, on boycott, divestment, and sanctions question. A Quaker Zionist rethinks Palestinian rights. So, without further ado, I now invite my dear friend Philip to speak.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. Thank you, John, and thank you, Anne, and the committee, the Peace Committee. I recognize some faces here. And thank you, the folks from the Muslim Community Center. Yes, like John said, I immigrated at the age of 27. I grew up in Jerusalem. That's from where I immigrated. And but I have very strong roots in Gaza as well. Three of my grandparents were from Gaza. Start from the beginning, maybe. They left quite some time back, my immediate family. So I grew up in Jerusalem. So the Farah family and the Jahshan family are still there. I will talk a little bit about that. So now, although the Palestinian Christian community in Gaza was really large and thriving, maybe about 10% of the population in the early 1900s. Now it's down to only 1,000 people. And because of the conditions, because of the many massacres, besides this one, the many massacres that preceded this, so many left and to seek opportunities elsewhere. By the way, 70% of the people of Palestine, of Gaza, are refugees. They came from other places where they were ethnically cleansed by Israel. Like my family was from West Jerusalem. So we ended up in East Jerusalem, which became part of Jordan. And the refugees, who 70% of the population of Gaza now, they were elsewhere in Palestine, ethnically cleansed, ended up in Gaza. And by the way, the Quakers have a big role in that story because they, actually, John is part of that story to some extent. His wife, I don't know if they know your story, John. John's wife was a survivor of an Japanese internment camp in the US. And the Quakers championed the Japanese who were interned. And so when she was a teenager, and when they were finally let go, that was 1948. And the Quakers called for volunteers to go to Palestine. And they were among the first people who went to provide aid to the Palestinian refugees who were streaming in from all the other places. And they did really amazing miracles. And because Toshi felt indebted to the Quakers for what they did in the internment camps, she volunteered, and she was one of the first people who went there. And they really did miracles, but they could not do, all the work that was needed. There was a huge number of refugees. Some were actually dying for lack of water on the beaches of Gaza at the time. And the UNRWA emerged to take over from the Quakers. So really, the Quakers played a really big role. Anyway, what happened to my video? I mean, my presentation. That's okay. Yeah. Oh, that's the end towards the end. Anyway, so it doesn't matter. It's okay. Don't worry about it.
This is the first one.
All the way to the top. Okay, so please next here. So the Ahli Hospital was one of the large hospitals in Gaza, and the original building was donated by my family. And Ahli Hospital, if you have been following the news, let me ask a question. How many of you have watched Al Jazeera since October? Yeah, okay. So I don't need to give you the gore of all that has been happening in Gaza. Al-Ahli, there were 270 people killed in Al-Ahli hospital, over 270 people in October. And that's part of the story. That hospital, like I said, the original building was donated by my family, and some of my relatives, my two uncles worked there, and other. Now the Palestinian Christian community, like I said, 1,000 of them, they have been sheltering at two churches. Saint Porphyrius is one of them, and the other one is called the Church of the Holy Family. Next, please. So I'm one of the founders of the Palestinian Christian Alliance for Peace. I'm going to talk to you about it at the end a little bit. So this is St. Philip's Chapel at the Ahli Hospital, and it was damaged badly. It was damaged in 2014, a rocket fell on it, and it was damaged again during this massacre now, series of massacres. Next, please. 270 people killed during a bombing of the compound surrounding the Ahli Hospital. This is St. Porphyrius Church, where my family, my father, uncles, aunts, grandparents were baptized and attended their weddings and, funeral, everything. This was the center of their life in the neighborhood called Zaytun, which has now been flattened. Next, please. This really has a history, which started long before October 7th. Americans are told, and the most people in the West are told, all of this started October 7th. Of course, it did not. This is a quote from one of the new historians, one of the most prominent historians in Israel, called Benny Morris, who documented the massacres that led to the ethnic cleansing that happened in 1948. I mention this because it's happening again, and because it really is, the ultimate culmination of Zionist ideology. And he wrote about 1948. Ben Gurion, who became Prime Minister of Israel, was already engaged in the expulsion of all the Palestinians, the ethnic cleansing, after a series of massacres, which Benny Morris documented very heavily. He should have completed the job. My feeling is that this place would be quieter, and no less suffering if the matter had been resolved once and for all. If Ben Gurion had cleansed the whole country, the whole land of Israel, as far as the Jordan River. And this is really what we see happening today in Gaza. It's the continuation of this ideology. Next, please. Bezalel Smotrich, the Minister of Finance of Israel, these are the people that our country is supporting now. He wrote, "We'll fill the West Bank with settlements and settlers until the Palestinians lose all hope of establishing a state. At that point, they'll have only three options: to leave, submit, or die." I'm going to depart from my presentation. I don't want to go further into what Israel is doing in Gaza. I mean, just to give you a glimpse of that, in the Washington Post today, there was an article about a doctor, Dr. Hani Bseso, who was the head of the orthopedic department at Al-Shifa Hospital, which has been destroyed, the largest Palestine complex in Gaza. Actually, if you can skip a few, I'm sorry, don't worry about it. And the article quotes Dr. Hani Bseso, an orthopedic doctor, saying how there was a video taken of this. Hani Bseso had to perform an anesthesia, an amputation on his knees, on his little young knees, without anesthesia. He had to do it with a kitchen knife and with, sewing equipment from the house. The Israelis have targeted hospitals. They have targeted hospitals because hospitals, the stupid Gazans thought that hospitals are going to be safe. So there were tens of thousands of people sheltering in the compounds of hospitals, including Al-Shifa Hospital. And they wanted to send a clear message to the Palestinians of Gaza that there is absolutely no place that is safe. Neither schools, United Nations schools, 150 United Nations employees have been killed by Israel. Israel has shattered all the records of murder and extermination, mass extermination that have occurred since the beginning of the 1900s. So, why am I saying all of this? I'm saying all of this to us because I think that our role in this country is extremely important. Israel has, an illusion that it is not part of our region, that it belongs to a civilized white world, the only kind of world that the Israelis care about. They don't care about what Pakistanis think, what South Africans who are accusing Israel of genocide think. They care only about what happens in the United States, public opinion in the US, especially in the rest of Europe. Exactly like the whites in South Africa under apartheid. It didn't matter what the rest of the world thought. But when the solidarity movement in the West started really getting stronger, all emancipatory movements in this country and elsewhere start with marginalized communities, start with students maybe, with slaves, with civil rights workers, a small minority. When they get to the churches, when they get to the mainstream, they're getting closer to power. And then they drag Congress, the Senate, and to the cause, kicking and screaming. And then the administration. This happened in South Africa. Reagan and Thatcher opposed until the bitter end. They continued buying and selling helicopters and military equipment to South Africa until the very end, until the movement here really got to the mainstream. When it got to the mainstream, South African apartheid collapsed psychologically, more than militarily, certainly. They could have crushed the ANC easily with more massacres as they were doing, and did not really suffer horribly economically. But when they saw that the only people in the world who mattered to them, the whites of Western Europe and America, then they started thinking again about. So in the tradition of Martin Luther King and Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, we ought to know that submission is not an option for the Palestinians. It's either a violent path to freedom, or it's a nonviolent movement. And this big secret that you don't know about in this country is that the Palestinians have always had a very vibrant nonviolent movement. And if we in this country do not give that movement hope, then the only option for the Palestinians will be violence. So how could anybody in their right mind think that what Israel is doing to the Palestinians is going to bring about peace with their neighbors? It's absolutely insane. But we have an extremely important role in this, just as Martin Luther King said, if you give hope to the nonviolent movement, then you are really even helping, you're helping everybody. because you're averting more bloodshed and you're averting, and this is what we're asking you to do. Because, you know, mainstream America is really what Israel cares for. And if we push one way is for you, and it's really important to be connected to organizations. There's so many now: Jewish Voice for Peace, American Muslims for Palestine, my group, the Syrian Christian Alliance for Peace. The Friends actually have this campaign, apartheid-free communities. And you know that if you connect with that effort, if you declare yourself an apartheid-free community, you will get, you know, directions about lobbying your congressman, lobbying your representatives, talking to the media. You know, if you see coverage that is biased, write the Washington Post. You know, thank them when they have good articles, and you know, set them straight when they are ignoring, you know, the suffering of the Palestinians. Thank you.
Good timing.
Right.
Thank you.
Well, 2 minutes early. I'll push it like it.
I realized I hadn't turned my. All right, now we're pleased to have Laila El-Haddad.
Close. Usually I get told to keep my voice down, so no need for amplification. Can you, I'm just, okay, waiting. I will say while he's doing that, John was relentless. And so it doesn't surprise me that he got us all here. For weeks, he's been calling me and texting me, leaving me messages and email notifications. Then he got Philip as an intermediary to try to convince me, so. Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you so much for all coming out on this very cold evening. And in order to understand where we're going, we first need to understand, of course, how we got here. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of context about Gaza. Actually, I'm going to time myself because I have a tendency to go way over. So I don't want to wait for the bell. I'm just going to see if I can. Okay, so you know, as you heard, I'm from Gaza. I was born in Kuwait. Both of my parents were born and raised in Gaza. We would then go back and commute on a regular basis. And you can go ahead to the next. Oh wait, is it not in? Oh, was this the next one? Okay, that's fine. Go ahead. So usually, what I like to say is when we mention the word Gaza, these are the, if you even search it in Google, these are all the images that come up. Actually, it's much worse now if you put, but people have a very difficult time being able to imagine what Gaza is like and what ordinary Palestinians might be doing in Gaza. And I think this is, for me, a big part of the problem. And, you know, I can get into that another time. I usually talk a lot about the dehumanization tactics and what that has done. How that has enabled Israel's occupation to continue in the genocide. This is Gaza City, and actually our house is very close to that. This area is called Al-Rimal. It's sort of the beating heart of Gaza, and this is called the Park of the Unknown Soldier in the middle. And I didn't have time to put a picture, but this entire park median has been completely destroyed. On the second day of the assault on Gaza, this was the first thing they hit. They wanted to hit the beating heart of the city. But I just usually like to start this way to show you the beauty of Gaza and what they think Gaza is like and what it is actually like. And so I mentioned that Gaza is the place where, you know, I wasn't born, but my parents were and raised. And when I ultimately returned to where I raised my young son for the first few years of his life, not so young now, but when he was young, where I worked for many years as a journalist and where all of my extended family still resides. So these are just some pictures from those early years during the years of 2004 through 2007. And you could keep going to the next slide. The reason I say this is because those were critical years, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why that's the case and helping us understand what's happening today. I just realized I didn't put my alarm on. But okay, but before I get to that, I just want to kind of situate Gaza historically. Because a lot of us really don't know much about it beyond what we see in the headlines. So I just like to remind people that Gaza historically has been at the nexus of civilizations and the crossroads between continents, and a hub along all major spice and trade routes, and shows up in so many texts, obviously, but it was also a major port along the Mediterranean and was famous for its barley and its innovation and its generosity, and many, many other things. So it's very hard to think of Gaza as a place that was actually rich and desirable and, you know, full of merchants and so on. But this is what Gaza is known for historically. So prior to 1948, Philip talked a little bit about that, the year that marks the founding of the state of Israel, and for Palestinians, their ethnic cleansing. This is when you would say Gaza, it didn't refer to the Gaza Strip that we know today. It actually referred to this area known as the Gaza District, right? So Palestine was divided into districts. This might look familiar because this is also the area that you might hear now in the modern vernacular referred to as the Gaza envelope. What happened in 1948 is hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were driven from their homes all over Palestine. For our purposes in Gaza, from this area, in an orchestrated plan, their places, their villages and towns were bombed. They were struck with fear and terror, and many fled to the nearest urban area to them here in the western part of Palestine. That would be Gaza. Tripled the population overnight, and the borders were sealed around them, and they were not meant to be permanent borders in the Egyptian-Israeli the armistice agreement of 1947 and 19 their homes, though they continuously demand the right of return. So that is why you might hear that Gaza, modern day Gaza, consists overwhelmingly of refugees who don't consider Gaza to be their permanent home, but rather these are their homes and villages. And in fact, if you ask them today, Palestinians will say, even in a place as small as Gaza, I am from the village of Beit Jirja, I'm from Beit Tima, not from Gaza. And their cooking reflects that, again, for another presentation. But okay, this is what the modern day map of Gaza looks like. On the right, as you can see, no exaggeration to say it is the most closed off place on earth. Everything about it is controlled by Israel, the airspace, the maritime access, the borders. And I just want to also situate it within the broader Palestinian, occupied Palestinian territories. I don't know if anyone will talk about that, but I do like to remind people that it is part of the greater Palestinian struggle. And you could see there, and the real takeaway here for those who are kind of new to this, is that Gaza is completely segregated and isolated, separated from the West Bank, as you can see. And in fact, the West Bank itself, all of the towns and villages within the West Bank are separated from one another by a series of Israeli military checkpoints. And in fact, Palestinians only have civil control authority, I don't even want to call it control, over 16% of the West Bank. So that's important, again, for another presentation, but important to keep in mind as we go. You can go to the next slide. And this is part of an overall, Israeli organizing principle in the words of Human Rights Watch that aims at advancing and cementing supremacy of one group over another, also known as apartheid. And this is accomplished through a series of mechanisms, mainly by ghettoizing Palestinians into small enclaves. As I said, I love the fact that he's following along with what I'm saying, with that little arrow, within the West Bank. And Gaza, you could consider it to be the largest of those ghettos. So the idea behind this is to maximize Israeli control over the land with as few Palestinians in that land as possible. And this is done, as I said, through a series of mechanisms, including, these are an example of the checkpoints on the right. And this is an example of the ID card that the Israelis use, and it's specific to the territory that you live in. So me as a Gaza resident, I would have to have been registered, which I am, on my mom's ID, and then I get a Gaza-specific ID that only allows me to travel to Gaza, not to anywhere else. And so Gazans can't travel without very difficult to obtain permission to the West Bank or Jerusalem, Jerusalemites can't travel to Gaza and West Bankers can't travel to either as well. Okay, so that takes us to the year 2005. And as I said, I was living in Gaza at the time with my son. I was covering this period, and you might have heard this seminal year referred to as the year that Israel ended its occupation from Gaza. Has anyone ever heard this before? In the news, maybe? Okay. And so the reality was the disengagement was a unilateral plan devised by former Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, and it was actually his son who gave him the idea. And it was very much a restructuring of Israel's occupation. And it was actually, his son had told him initially to call it the separation plan. I don't know if you know this, it's very interesting. But then he thought that that sounded too similar to apartheid in Hebrew, and it sounded really bad. But ultimately, that's what they wanted to accomplish. This is separate Gaza from the West Bank and from Israel. So they reframed it, renamed it disengagement. And it was a restructuring of Israel's occupation. Instead of being, so they dismantled the illegal settlements from within Gaza, relocated the Israeli settlers elsewhere, and retained control over all of Gaza's borders, airspace, sea space, taxation system, the population registry remotely and from outside of Gaza. Those were some pictures that I had taken during that year. Palestinians accessing this beach for the first time in decades. That was previous to this day for the exclusive use of the Rosh Latif settlement block. And these children who had for the first time been able to look outside of Gaza, and they were trying to figure out what an Egyptian looks like, is what they told me, because they had never, I mean, this is just, it's also something to bear in mind that most of the population has never left Gaza. So again, disengagement is also, known as what I like to call Occupation 2.0. And in the words of Ariel Sharon's chief of staff at the time, who helped him devise the plan, it was to be considered nothing more than formaldehyde that was intended to indefinitely freeze the political process with the Palestinians and nothing more. It was not to be considered an end of the occupation. It was sort of a strategic, oh no, is that it? There's no way. I have so much to get through. No? You want me to end right there? Okay. Okay, I'm gonna give myself 3 minutes. That's what I have here. Anyway, that happens on the heels of that are the Palestinian elections of 2006. Prior to this point, Israel had closed all of Gaza's borders and plunged the economy and into tatters. And that was unprecedented prior to that point. All the commercial crossings were closed. The Palestinian elections happened, which sees Hamas rise to power. I'm gonna have to go really quickly. You can go to the next slide. The US is not too happy with this, and the CIA gets involved and does what the CIA does best, and they try to overthrow, and they funnel in millions of dollars in arms into Gaza. That doesn't work out too well. And Hamas, who was, again, the elected government at the time, counter coups and takes control over Gaza. You can keep going. Okay. In response to this, Israel begins its economic sanctions on Gaza and the beginning of what is known as the weaponization of food, in which they begin to restrict the amount of calories that are allowed into Gaza. And again, Dov Weisglass calls this the Gaza diet. And he says the idea is to put Palestinians on a diet, but not make them die of hunger. In other words, keep Gaza constantly on the brink of collapse, teetering on the edge of collapse. This leads to the full out blockade on Gaza that started in 2007. Which was an extension of some form of closure that has already existed on Gaza for a very long time. The main intention and the stated goals was to further fragment the Palestinians and separate Gaza from the West Bank. And it should be understood mainly as a siege on people's life, liberty, and the ability to prosper, develop, and be productive. We can just fast forward through this since I'm out of time, but it leads to a situation where fishermen are fishing without water because of the severe restrictions on maritime fishing zones, farming without land because of this buffer zone in Gaza's north that was created, and massive amounts of farmland that was raised, and Gaza living on the brink of collapse. This is from a WikiLeaks document in which the Israelis tell the Americans that the idea is to keep the Gaza economy on the brink of collapse without quite pushing it over the edge. This was the objective behind the blockade. It also, of course, was a blockade not just on the entry and exit of goods, but also on people. 50% of Gaza's population is under the age of 18, 75% is under the age of 25. The majority have never left Gaza. And if you are 16 years old in Gaza today, you would have endured 6 separate assaults, including the one that we're facing today, that they're facing today. You can keep going. I think I'm almost done, I promise. Philip covered this, so I don't want to dwell too much on it. This is just some very harrowing statistics of what is going on right now on the 105th day by now of the genocide in Gaza. I think I just have one more. This, I just wanted to honor my relatives, some of my relatives who were killed in the early days of the war in Gaza. This was my aunt and my cousin who were killed in their homes in Gaza City in late October. And just ending on a more hopeful note, I always say to people, despite all this, Palestinians continue to innovate, continue to resist in any way they know how, and whether it's just by existing and being, whether it's by innovating, by creating, in this case, 3D printers from scratch, from recycled materials. This workshop was bombed 2 separate times. They were printing tourniquets and burn masks for victims. And so the targets are often deliberate and systematic in terms of hitting at not just the commercial hubs of Gaza, but also anything that might be productive. Universities and civic centers and workshops, factories. This is a friend of mine who's an engineer who was building materials to help Palestinians rebuild after the last assault from recycled materials. And I always say I derive hope, I most hope from not just ordinary citizens, but you can keep going, but from farmers who I find, like that farmer that you just saw replanting his farm 3 separate times. And when I asked him what kept him going, he said, I have no choice. This is my way of resisting. And when asked, what can we do? I just will leave you with a few thoughts here. No action is too small, I always say. Whatever it is that you have time for, that you're able to do, that you're good at, whether it's writing a letter to the editor, whether it's learning a little bit more as you're doing today, whether it's hosting maybe a supper club or wearing a conversation starter, all of those things help. And right now in the current moment, disrupting as much as we can. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I'm sure there'll be some questions and.
We're on here.
Oh, your mic,
He's just saying, I'm sure there'll be questions. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting us. And as John said, I'm Shelley Cohen Fudge, and I'm with Jewish Voice for Peace. I actually live in Silver Spring, Maryland. So we represent, our chapter here represents DC, the suburbs around DC, which includes Montgomery County and PG County, as well as Northern Virginia. And we also have a chapter in Baltimore. So I'm going to change the topic a little bit. But before I do that, I can't tell you how difficult it is listening to both Philip and to Laila. And I actually had an opportunity to go visit Gaza very soon after the 2008-2009 assault by Israel. And as this is happening, I'm having terrible nightmares. I saw at that time whole villages destroyed. I will never forget visiting one of them, and the only thing left were just total devastation and children who were left to try to find some type of food. They were all orphans, and they're just wandering around in a daze. And I saw so many things destroyed. I saw schools destroyed. I saw hospitals that were damaged, not totally destroyed, or not nearly the amount of damage that's taking place there now. Mosques, I mean, you name it. And it's really tough. And both my partner and I, who is here with me tonight, who's from the West Bank, and he could tell you, if he was up here, about the horrors happening there as well, that we're not even hearing about. But I'm going to change the topic a bit, and I'm going to address
the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is fear. Fear that if you express support, and I mean all of us, for Palestinian rights or a ceasefire in Gaza, you could be in danger of being labeled as anti-Semitic. I may be unique here though, because I've both personally experienced true anti-Semitism, and I've also been accused of being an anti-Semite. And you may ask why? How could that be? Well, it's because I'm a proud anti-Zionist Jewish American. So whereas Judaism is a religion, I'm sure you recognize that, Zionism is a political philosophy. They're entirely different. Anti-Zionists, like myself, oppose that political philosophy because it's based on the need for a nation state with exclusive rights for Jews above all others who live in the land of historic Palestine. And when I say all, I don't mean just Palestinians. I mean everyone else. Jews get so many rights that nobody else gets. And I'm talking about even inside Israel, not just in the occupied territories. But the Israeli government and anti-Palestinian rights organizations here in the US and across the world run concerted campaigns to redefine and misstate the meaning of anti-Semitism, with the aim of falsely conflating it with criticisms of Israel and Zionism. Now, the use of Jewish stereotypes and conspiracy theories are part and parcel of other racist ideologies that endanger people of color, those who are of various minority religions throughout the US and elsewhere, and others who suffer discrimination and violence from white nationalists. In other words, it's important to avoid isolating anti-Semitism from other forms of oppression that rely upon fear and hate. So criticism of Israeli policies and actions is no different than criticizing other political ideologies or policies of any nation state, including our own nation state right here in the United States. So why am I bringing this up? Because fear has exponentially increased among American Jews and other Jews across the world due to Zionist propaganda on the part of Israel and throughout the US that equates Hamas's October 7th crime against humanity. It was a crime against humanity. But it's being purported as the worst catastrophe for Jews since the Holocaust. And I suppose that could be true. But it's being used as an excuse to suppress free speech, to shut down all expression of support for Palestinian rights. And that's where you come in. We need your help to stave off attempts to suppress free speech, in particular in Maryland, right here in Maryland. During this year's session of the Maryland General Assembly that started last week, and it ends April 28th. Last Monday, the formation of the first ever Maryland Jewish Legislative Caucus was announced. It includes 20 Jewish state lawmakers. And on January 9th, Adrian Jones, the Maryland General Assembly Speaker of the House of Delegates announced that a package of bills will be introduced this session that combat prejudice and hate against Maryland's Jewish community. She didn't mention combating any other prejudice and hate, only anti-Semitism. Well, we know, those of us with Jewish Voice for Peace, because we've actually been able to get to look at some of that legislation early on. It hasn't yet been introduced, but we know it's coming. It's actually amounting to the same type of dangerous attempts to squelch free speech that have already been happening across the rest of the country. Many states and local governments across the country have already passed bills and resolutions that do just that. That is squelching speech and any support for Palestinian rights. I worked with a group of Montgomery County organizations for months in the fall of 2022, voicing opposition to a dangerous anti-Semitism definition. It was passed unanimously by the Montgomery County Council in fall 2022. As much as we tried, we could not stop it. Similarly, I worked with a statewide coalition in Virginia to oppose a statewide resolution there across the entire state. It also passed unanimously in the Virginia, I'm not sure if that was unanimous, but it was pretty close to it, in the Virginia General Assembly session last year. This meeting house, or it's not the meeting house, but whatever you call this particular building next to the meeting house, is located in Maryland's Legislative District 14, in case you don't know. I noticed. The district state senator is Craig Zucker. He is one of the leading General Assembly members who are trying to defund the immigrant rights group called Casa de Maryland. Do you know why? It's because the president once posted a social media message calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. That's why. Take away all their funding. They are the premier immigrant rights and support institution in this state and in other states in the area as well. I'm almost certain, I don't know for sure, it hasn't been announced yet, but I'm almost certain that Zucker, as well as one of your state General Assembly delegates, Ann Kaiser, are members of this new Jewish Legislative Caucus. Now, in addition to all of that going on, right here in this county, there is an attempt to shut it down as well for our students and teachers. So the school system has already put 4 teachers on administrative leave merely for putting something on their own personal social media supporting Palestinian rights. And they're allowing the Jewish Community Relations Council, the American Defamation League, and the Israel-American Council to provide anti-Semitism training that equates anti-Semitism with criticism of the Israeli government. Thus, I want to urge every one of you to get involved. You can play an important role. You need to protest this. You need to get meetings with all of your delegates right here in District 14 and your Senator Zucker, and also work with others like me and others who are working on this. We're going to make it a major effort, and we really welcome you to do that. You can make a difference.
Shelley, do you have a bill number or something?
Not yet. We have not, none of these bills have been introduced yet, but we know they're coming. It's been announced. So there's a way to keep in touch. Maryland Matters, by the way, if you ever look at that, can tell you, but I've got some cards over there and you can contact me and I can help you get involved. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shelley. And now we have Steve Chase.
Thank you so much, everybody. I am deeply honored to be with this panel. And part of me is going, well, why? I'm a latecomer to this issue. In fact, historically, I have been part of the problem. The good part of my background is when I was about 6 or 7 years old, I heard the word Holocaust and I went to my mom and said, what is it? I could tell from context it was a bad thing. And think about a mother with a Gentile kid in a small town in Illinois who asks her that question. She can tell the truth and crush the child's spirit, or she can lie. And my mother doesn't lie. So she told me 11 million people killed by a industrial apparatus of extermination, 6 million of them Jews. But then she told me about the resistance that was happening under Nazi occupation in Denmark and Norway. And so I learned about the worst of human behavior towards other human beings. And I also heard about real solidarity. And my mother was she never let me just figure out the moral of the story. She liked to just tell me. And she said, if you are ever in a targeted group, you need to reach out for allies. You need to build solidarity and you need to fight like hell to protect human rights and protect human lives. And then she said, and if you are not part of a targeted group, but you see one, you have the moral responsibility to stand up. And I would like to say before anything that regardless of our different analysis or visions or strategies about how to create a just peace in Israel-Palestine, we need to reach to the value level of that everybody between the river and the sea deserves peace, security, freedom, equality, and human rights. And that's not what's happening. And it hasn't been happening for a long time. There have been some really good quotes about Israeli leaders. One that I use, because I went on a Quaker delegation in June to largely the West Bank, traveling around, and then sometime in occupied East Jerusalem, and then into Galilee and up north towards the Lebanon border. 3 weeks. And it was heartbreaking. It was the most intense 3 weeks of my life. And from that visit, I have to do what my mama told me. And I think it's important to call, but it's like, as a teenager, I thought that Israel was one of the most progressive, democratic, and positive states in the world. I thought it was essential to Jewish liberation. And it was one of the only strategies to fight anti-Semitism. And I believed, and I apologize because frankly, it was a racist view. I believed that all the complaints by Palestinians had nothing to do with being oppressed, but that they were anti-Semitic and culturally and monolithically violent.
Yeah.
It took me listening to my progressive Jewish friends who had actually been to Israel and saying there's a lot that they love about the culture, but the oppression of the 20% of Palestinian Israeli citizens in Israel is bad, but it's so intense in the occupied territories. And then I started getting to know more Quakers who were involved in Israel-Palestine. But I still had the vestiges of the racist view I had of Palestinians. I didn't take Palestinian criticisms of their treatment over the last 100 years seriously. I could listen to Jews, I could listen to Quakers, and both the Quakers and progressive Jews I knew said, man, you have to really open your heart. You have to realize that no people is a monolith. You have to understand a history here, and you have to listen to it from Jews. It was only 10 years ago that I met a Palestinian. And at that point, I was ready to listen and to ask questions. And Syed Atshan, who's now the head of Swarthmore's Peace and Social or Conflict Studies, was patient and supportive, gave me things to read. I hadn't read Edward Said before that. Why would I do that? I was only reading the new Israeli historians and not, the Palestinian historians. And this is common in America. And when we're talking about what next for Israel and Palestine, we don't determine in the United States what happens, but we massively influence and we enable apartheid, and we're enabling, if it is not already risen to the level of genocide, it's on the genocidal trajectory. I hate it when I hear in the news that we're talking about the Israel-Hamas war. We're talking about, yes, 3,000 of the military wing on October 7th for a couple of days did some really war crimes, crimes against humanity for 1,200 people, and wounded others and captured some and took them back to Gaza. That is true. But what is the response? The right to self-defense would mean you use the Iron Dome to keep missiles from Gaza hitting something. The right to self-defense would mean that your army would neutralize the military operatives that were in Israel, and you'd push people back. And then you would start negotiating while the world stands horrified at what just happened, and use that international pressure to get your hostages back. And if you were really smart, then you'd think about, well, there is never going to be peace without justice. And that's the thing. There's a right to that limited self-defense, but there is not the right to tyranny. And the US has enabled that tyranny. And I just want to tell two stories about my trip where I still had the vestiges of being the problem. We were going to go to Jenin and to the refugee camp at Jenin one day. And that was the day for the first time in 20 years that the Israelis did air bombardment of the camp. So we couldn't go. We went to a refugee camp in Nablus, which is not that far away. This is a very small place in the world. And it was really, really tense. Now, the aerial bombardment was done with US military technology. And several people were killed. It was a long fight. The next day, on a highway near Nablus, 2 Palestinians with guns killed 4 illegal Israeli settlers at a convenience and gas station right on Highway 60, which we had passed the day before. And both of them were killed. The next day, we're meeting with Mustafa Barghouti, who is the head I think it's the Palestinian Medical Relief Society. He's a doctor. He's also a really amazing political leader, has a party. He co-founded with Edward Said, a great Palestinian political party that has a program that just makes my heart beat really well. The future would be very, very good with this kind of leadership being able to come to the fore. But so he's telling us about health disparities, that if you have cancer in the West Bank, you have to go to Jerusalem. 40% of the people in Palestine who have cancer do not get permits that allow them to go to the hospital. Of the others, you pay 4 times as much as an Israeli citizen would pay. Oh my. Okay, so, but we were noticing that he kept getting phone calls in the middle of the meeting with us. And I'm sitting there getting irritated with this man. You know, we scheduled this time. Why is he taking phone calls? And then he said that after the attack on Jenin, after the 2 gunmen killed the 4 settlers, he said, I'm really sorry about this, but we're getting calls all over the West Bank, and there have been 50 settler attacks on different Palestinian communities in that one day. And I'm thinking, oh, it must be a lot, and that's terrible, but 50, I think he's just exaggerating to make a point. That night in the Haaretz newspaper, I read that it was 85 communities that were attacked by armed settlers who were being defended by the occupation military forces in one day. And it's only gotten worse since October 7th in the West Bank. One other quick story is that we got to meet with the first Palestinian woman who's an ordained minister in either Palestine or Israel, Sally Azar. She was great. And as she was talking, she talked about her family having to move and being kicked out of where they lived in 48. And she said, and to this day, her family, which lives in East Jerusalem, they have go bags packed, ready to go. And again, naively, I'm going, oh, I can see historically why she would, think that. But yeah, that night when I got home and I went online and I was reading Haaretz newspaper, it quoted Benjamin Netanyahu talking private in a ministerial meeting. And the story was, he said, listen, we've already trained over 20 brigades of the IDF to go, and this is the quote, all out war against Palestinian Israeli citizens anytime we need to.
Wow.
So she was not exaggerating. She wasn't just living out of a historical trauma. These are the things that face today. And I just encourage people. The one good thing about this is I gave a talk to a Quaker meeting last week, and one person said, I haven't paid any attention to Israel and Palestine since October 7th. And the bad thing about that is we need to learn the history because it didn't begin on October 7th. The good thing about it is this is a huge teachable moment, and it may not take the decades it's taken me to move from a naive and unwittingly oppressive and to some real degree racist perspective, and have to recover from that to get a critical thinking and move ahead. The other thing I'll say about hope is talking about the title, What Next for Israel Palestine? If we only think about the probabilities, the prognosis is not good. I encourage us to think about the possibilities. And what we do, and certainly what this country ends up doing, can make a huge difference. And we don't know what the future is. And when I used to teach activist training students at Antioch University, oftentimes people would say, well, how do you have hope? And I said, it's a choice. If you assume you don't have hope, you've created a self-fulfilling prophecy that the status quo will stay or get worse. If you assume that there is at least a possibility of improvement and positive change, that leaves the future open. And so the idea that Laila was talking about is just figure out what time you have. Figure out what you're good at. Figure out who you can connect with. And we can build a movement for peace and justice for all who live between the river and the sea. And we can stop the US being the major enabling factor that's creating this horrific situation. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all the speakers who did a wonderful job. Now, we'd love to have some questions. And Nick Mason, member of the Peace Committee, will come to you and give you the mic.
First off, I'd like to ask the panel, do you think it would be practical to, if we ask questions right after the speaker has presented something? Because I'm thinking, oh, I was going to ask that question, but now I hear the other story and I forgot. Do you think that, or would that draw it out too far? Anyway,
Just to ask a question, Ari.
yeah.
Yeah, because we've all done the speaking, so we can't go back.
Yeah. That's why I said we should do it right after somebody spoke. Anyway, I had a bunch of questions. So one of them was the Israelis claim that they are bombing the hell out of the hospitals and so on because there are because Hamas has a network of computers and weapons and stuff like that. None of that has actually been substantiated as far as I can see. Does anybody have anything concrete on that one?
I mean, like you said, the BBC, even the Western mainstream media, which I think there has been a study about how the reports have been in the mainstream Western media, and it's incredible. I mean, how much there's like to every mention of Palestinians being killed, there are many others, multiple mentions of the hostages and the 1,100 Palestinians, Israelis plus who have been killed. But even these media outlets like the Washington Post, the BBC, CNN have been totally dissatisfied with whatever Israel has presented to them about the tunnels. But of course, there is a tunnel system. But to say that there is a command and control headquarters in the Al-Shifa hospital, and that's an excuse for basically destroying its operations is totally wrong. Again, one really has to look for outlets other than the mainstream media to get good information. And that's why I really encourage you, please, the Friends Service Committee is running this campaign, apartheid-free campaign. And if you connect with them, then you will get very good resources, media resources, action items, who to write to your congressman, what messages, etc. So I urge you, I left some cards, these cards, some of them, they're not enough for everybody, but please, if you're interested, pick one up.
I have about I'm sorry, did I give you enough time? I didn't want to cut you off. I have a question, and that is that I'm very much interested in people that have skin in the game, that have suffered and that have seen firsthand and that have been victims. But there are victims all around, and people that have skin in the game have very significant voices. For that introduction, my main question is, I have very, very, very strong hope that there are dissenting voices within Israel. And I wonder what the chances are that they will gain more strength and against what is going on. That no people are monolithic where they all hate this or all hate that. There are some very well-intentioned people on both sides. And those are the people that need to get stronger and need to expand on that. And so I'm very much concerned. And just as an aside, I read recently in the news where there's an awful lot of people, including IDF people, that are against Netanyahu, and they want an election and they want him removed within 2 months. And I wonder, in other words, we can't assume that all Israelis are this way or all Palestinians are Hamas or things like that. There are conciliatory people that want to work for justice and peace. And I wonder if they can be strengthened and what the possibility is for those people to expand more and more and more so that we can get some progress in the right direction.
I'll try to address that. So I don't know how many of you were really paying attention before October 7th, but over the entire last year, every single week, there were thousands and thousands of Israelis who were protesting in the streets against Netanyahu. Now, that doesn't mean that they were protesting about anything regarding Palestinians. They were protesting because Netanyahu, not only is he a criminal, he's on there's a huge number of corruption charges against him. A lot of people think that the primary reason why he is so determined to keep this going is because as long as it keeps going, it prevents him from being booted out from his corruption charges. Now, I can tell you that I work with a lot of, unfortunately, Israeli left-wing and leftist and even centrists who have given up on Israel. I know many who felt left to leave. If you ever read Haaretz, and a few of the writers are extremely courageous. Most of them have to have bodyguards. Practically all of the Israeli historians that were mentioned, who went through the archives and discovered data, the Israeli IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, and a lot of data showing that yes, indeed, there was a massacre back in 48, and there was, a huge amount of ethnic cleansing. Of course, we call it, and they call it, the Nakba. A lot of people are calling this one the second Nakba, and I certainly would consider it that. But it is actually quite depressing, because for many years, anything to do with Palestinians, they weren't even mentioned. And in fact, the Israeli press that I keep up with, as well as the Jewish press here, the Jewish establishment Zionist press here, it tells us that since October 7th, that in Israel, they are not getting one iota of news of what's even going on in Gaza. That's intentional. All they ever hear about is the hostages, is about Hamas, and they sincerely believe Israel has nothing to do with what's going on if they do hear anything about Gaza. That's all Hamas's fault. It is revenge that's taking place. And that's pretty pervasive. So I'm sorry to say that I actually believe that there's very little opposition and very, very minimal support for a ceasefire or anything that would help the Palestinians in any of it. And also, the Palestinian citizens, the few that are even willing to say a word, and I've been reading about this quite a lot, they are terrified. They're getting arrested. I mean, here we're talking about a loss of freedom of speech, particularly on college campuses, but they are getting arrested. They're losing their jobs if they say one word about Gaza. So that means the rest of the international community are the ones that are going to have to take action, in my opinion.
Thanks.
Steve
wants to say something.
Yeah, I mean, there's tremendous anger at Netanyahu in Israeli society, and some of it's being led by the families of the hostages who are saying, this is endangering our people, cut a deal, move, and beginning to talk about a ceasefire, which is pretty impressive. But one of the things that I'm not sure is widely known in the United States, maybe it is, but that Netanyahu funneled money and support to Hamas in the early years because that was, as his stated claim, that will allow us to prevent the state of Palestine ever existing because it'll split the national movement and we will always have a bogeyman to point to saying, well, you know, maybe, yeah, sure, we want peace, but there's no partner for peace. The other thing is, you know, given the time of their massive expansion for the illegal settlements in the West Bank, even though the Netanyahu government's intelligence services had the 40-page written plan called Jericho Wall, which was the plan for the attack, they ignored it and they actually moved 31 battalions of the IDF forces from the border and moved them, redeployed them to the West Bank to protect the settlers. And that's why it lasted as long and it was as damaging as it was on the 7th and 8th, because they did not have sufficient forces to protect Israeli civilians.
Excuse me. We have some questions from the
There was one question.
Zoom audience. Well, I think let's skip. Brian, can you direct?
Oh,
I noticed Adele was
oh,
listening.
no. Oh, yeah.
Maybe she's not there right now.
Oh, gosh.
Can you
anyone else?
read the question there?
Oh,
They consider that a question from the audience?
Oh, yeah, an interesting question. Are there any available curricula for K through 12 students or even higher ed that are current on this conflict and can be implemented quickly? If so, can you please provide links, contact information, or the like? Children's religious education could use these at the Quaker meetings, or would even make it easier to educate all meetings in a timely manner.
I don't know that any specific curriculum. I know that that's something that a lot of educational consultants, like my friend Adir Shinawi in here in Maryland is working on, but there is teachpalestine.org. And there's a compilation of resources on there and specifically for teachers to incorporate into their classrooms. But I myself, I don't know if anyone else knows a specific curriculum. Do you? A lot of it is just kind of the onus falls, I think, on the teachers to curate, you know, that, but I think there's a lot of interest in that specifically. I know I've been approached by multiple schools to help them develop such a curriculum. But there are some resources online like Teach Palestine.
There's more and more resources for adults. I know that I have seen some wonderful books for children and younger children. I'm not sure about high school. I think there needs to be more.
Yeah, I also wonder what, they're saying K to 12, right? Because there's a lot of, I always point to a lot of great resources, I would say, but more for high school and college, but not the younger one. I've seen a lot of great lists of like, you know, these books for this age and this book for that age. And, but yeah, I would just go to, I think it's a Middle East, it's what Mecca stands for, Mecca for Peace Initiative, but it's teachpalestine.org is probably a good place to start.
Anyone from Zoom have a question?
Oh, okay, so thank you very much. I did have one comment that stood out to me. I forget which one of you talked about it, but it was about what is Gaza? What is the culture there? That there's really people that live there, and I think for Americans, it's like you think of Gaza, what do you think of? I mean, there's some olive trees there. What is the economy like there? How does it work?
It's nice that you associated olive trees with it because mostly people just think of like bombed out buildings. But it's funny that you say that because once I was in St. Lucia many years ago, and we were walking down this small town, and I saw all spray painted all over the walls, Gaza. I can't remember if it was Gaza gang or Gaza something. And I was like, oh, that's so neat that they know about Gaza. And I was seeing this everywhere. I didn't know why this was on the walls. And then I asked one of the locals and he said, oh, this is the name of like this, I don't know if it was a music group or a gang, an actual gang. And I was like, well, why are they called Gaza? Like, I think it was a gang. And I said, do you know where Gaza is? He's like, no, I have no idea. But we just know that we associate the word Gaza with like, you know, kind of like badass, like tough, you know, resilient. And so that's what the name of the gang is. And I was like, so anyways, but it's kind of like that way here. We have these abstract notions of what Gaza might be. And that's partly why I know you said that's not the time to talk about it, but that was the idea behind my book, The Gaza Kitchen, was precisely to use, you know, in the case of the book, food as a platform to talk about our situation. And to be able to highlight, you know, not just the culture, obviously, but how the current situation is impacting the culture. Because when we talk about sort of an ongoing genocide, it's not just against the people, but it's against their way of living as well. 40% of the agricultural infrastructure and assets have been destroyed. For example, you mentioned olive trees. You know, I could go on and on, but the culture, I mean, in short, it's part and parcel of broader Palestinian culture. And of course, you know, regionally, it's part of the in Arabic, we say Bilad al-Sham, but the greater Levant, right? Palestine, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria. As I mentioned, historically, Gaza itself pops up a lot because even that region separate from the rest of Palestine, it was kind of, you know, the entry point for any invading army who wanted to conquer, you know, anything, Jerusalem, the Levant, whatever, they all had to go there from Alexander the Great on, right? And you see a lot of, I mean, I could go on for like an hour about this, but you see a lot of those elements incorporated. You know, but yeah, the modern day culture, Gazans generally are known for their hospitality, their generosity. I hope if you ever have a chance to visit, you'll see that we don't bite. It just seems that way, but I just remember that anytime I've ever gone in, even though I'm from there, the taxi driver always invites me to his house. I don't even know him. And he says, you must come and have dinner with us. But that's kind of the spirit of Gaza. And in fact, it's hard to imagine, but there was a time when Israelis themselves in the 1980s would go to Gaza to have dinner because they were known for their seafood and the seafood restaurants and to buy their furniture from Gaza and to go get their teeth done, the dentists in Gaza. There's a thriving furniture industry there, textile industry as well. But it's just so, it's kind of like there's a cognitive dissonance when we think about those things now in conjunction with Gaza. And even in the modern day, prior to the war. Gaza was a very vibrant hub of tech innovators as well, of young tech innovators and you know, scholars and so on. I was just saying, I'm certainly not an expert on this, but the one thing I can confirm. So when I mentioned that I went to Gaza in 2009. My father, my family were flipping out, you know, oh my God, you're going to be killed. You're Jewish. You're going to Gaza. And instead, oh my gosh, I was welcomed with open arms and they were just wonderful. And and I was embarrassed. I remember going to a few homes and getting served these amazing meals and thinking, oh my gosh, how much they're spending for this. But it was definitely that. But also, Gaza had a reputation for at least quite a while for all of its agricultural exports. I mean, they had everything from flowers and fruits, and it was enormous. We don't think about that now. And I don't know, you know, it's definitely been deteriorating for a lot of reasons, but they had that as well. I wanted to just mention though one thing. I felt like after I said what I said, I'm really sounding so negative. There is something that is very positive, even though we're going through this horrible, horrible genocidal crisis. Our organization, Jewish Voice for Peace, is growing exponentially. And I cannot express to you how much many, particularly young Jews, are saying, wait a minute, our elders are wrong. This is not right. And they are getting involved. They're getting active. And I don't know how many of you know about what happened right here in DC several times with huge numbers of Jews, most of them young, but not all of them, who shut down, you know, the Cannon House office building, and 300 of them, and 25 rabbis got arrested, and they shut down in New York, they shut down Grand Central Station, and the Statue of Liberty, and the Manhattan Bridge, and out in California and Chicago and all over, and it's being led by Jewish Americans. There is really hope. Yeah.
And another thing is that unions used to be a stronghold for support for Israel. And now the United Auto Workers Union, the Postal Union, and several on Democracy Now, you know, there was a speaker who actually happened to be Jewish, a Jewish labor activist. And he said, you know, I just can't name all of the unions that have now called for a ceasefire and defied. And when was the last time you saw 60 staffers from the White House standing in front of the White House, you know, in open defiance of the policy of the president? You know, they were carrying signs saying ceasefire. And this was just, you know, fairly early in the game. Then we are really winning the struggle for hearts and minds. And believe me, I am a strong believer that if we strengthen the movement further in the US, the Israeli peace movement of Jews will revive and become stronger and stronger. Today was in a way, a landmark. For the first time, a young Jewish boy, a young man, was arrested for refusing to serve in the army. And I really think that the more we grow our movement here, the more Israelis will come out of the woodwork and start a peace movement as well. It's insane. I mean, to think that this is going to bring about peace, you must be out of your mind.
Yeah, go ahead. Any question from the Zoom?
Oh, Ray. You're muted, Ray.
Oh, right.
Thank you. I have a question. Netanyahu's position is the first thing we need to do is wipe Hamas off the face of the earth. Then we'll see. I'd like to hear from the Palestinians on the panel, given American influence. If we did get a ceasefire, who should Israel be negotiating with? And what is the path out of this, realistically?
Yeah. So I always like to share this anecdote. I usually have a slide when I have more time that I cover that talks about Israel's repressive tone and relationship
We're not
vis-a-vis.
hearing you.
Oh, yeah. Is that? Do I need to be louder? Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah, I'm sorry, it was my end. I apologize.
Okay, I'm okay now, you can hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was saying that usually when I have more time, I have a slide in which I discuss Israel's repressive history vis-a-vis the Gaza Strip, to demonstrate that it is nothing new and it is part of this kind of overarching policy that I discussed. And I give an example in particular in the 1970s. Ariel Sharon had gone in, was a commander at the time, and gone into Gaza and executed 1,000 men and razed down hundreds of homes and with an armored bulldozer, which earned him the moniker, the bulldozer. And the idea was to pacify what he called the Palestinian resistance, also known at the time as the Fidaiyin, the resistance fighters. Now, they belong to not Hamas, but a movement called the Palestinian Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP. So at that time, they were considered the problem. They were considered the biggest terrorists, the bogeyman, and Israel, of course, continued to claim that it had no partner to negotiate with. Many years later, the same scenario would be repeated in Lebanon in the early 80s with Fatah, which is the party that ultimately would sort of become the Palestinian Authority. And then, of course, Hamas came to dominate the scene in 2000s. My point being, it's not Hamas, it's Israel. It's Israeli apartheid in particular. And there's always going to be a bogeyman on the Palestinian side that is a problem, that is considered to be a terrorist, that is considered to be a non-partner to negotiate with. And you could take that same language that Netanyahu was using, we don't have a partner, et cetera, and go back to headlines from 2000 when Yasser Arafat was around and he was referred to as there's no partner for peace and a terrorist, and go back earlier, as I said, to the 80s and to the 70s. So ultimately, you kind of have to shift your thinking, or not you, but anyone, all of our thinking on this perspective, to understand that it's not about eliminating whatever happens to be, the threat of the decade, but rather ending Israel's military occupation and system of apartheid. And I should say, if we even want to just tackle the question more directly, yesterday Netanyahu, or I don't know if it was Netanyahu or someone in the war cabinet, acknowledged finally that they cannot actually defeat Hamas. And this makes sense. I'm sure they knew this from the beginning, because the idea was never a war on Hamas or to defeat Hamas, but rather to continuously, in the Israeli vernacular, mow the lawn in Gaza. And this is a policy that every few years they will attack Gaza, brutally, ruthlessly, in the words of the Israeli military spokes, the emphasis is on damage, not on accuracy or precision. The idea is to make Gaza unlivable and to continually pacify the Palestinians, break them down to the point where they will no longer attempt to resist.
Of course, that latter, it's amazing. I mean, yes, mowing the lawn was the thing, at least 6 times, as Laila mentioned, but this is going much further.
Yeah, no, this is way beyond mowing the lawn. This is okay. We have the green light from the Americans. There are no red lines. In the words of Kirby, we're going to take this to the furthest extremes of our imagination and try to, push. But there's another term for this that they use. It's called thinning the population in Gaza, to try to get rid of as many Palestinians as we can, or to make the situation so unlivable that, given the chance, they would voluntarily leave.
Yeah, so it's really about ethnic cleansing. It's not just about murder and genocide. They know they can't kill them all, but I think that we all have to recognize Hamas is never going to be defeated. It's a political ideology and it's a movement. And it is not something that can be killed. You cannot kill it. In fact, they're strengthening it. Every Hamas militant that they kill is being replaced by young people who are so enraged, and they have every right to be. And they're being not even just recruited, they're joining. They're joining, unfortunately, not just, in replacing in Gaza. It's happening in the West Bank. It's going to happen and it's going to increase. And that's why, of course, we're all saying it is crazy, as Philip was just saying, to think that this is going to be a way to pacify and to create peace. It's going to do the opposite.
I mean, I think that, if there's a situation where Israel is going to negotiate with anybody, the right thing is for the Palestinians, all the Palestinians between the river and the sea, to choose their own representatives democratically, and then that'll be the party that you will negotiate with. And the more, like I keep saying the same thing, that the more we give hope to the nonviolent strands in Palestinian resistance, especially the boycott and divestment movement, the more we prevent, the more we strengthen those who seek nonviolent ways of emancipation.
I'm really glad Philip mentioned the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, because as much as we have to pressure the United States government to stop enabling, turning that ship of state around is going to take time. But as various civil society groups all throughout the world, in the same way a international solidarity movement emerged that was applying boycotts and divestments against South African apartheid, helped shift the balance in the word tone. So it's like, yes, we should lobby. Yes, we should do direct action. Yes, for litigation. Yes, for working hard on elections to get people who will have a genuine across the board, single standard human rights view. But there's things that we also can do on our own without waiting for the US government. The labor unions example is huge, and organization. And that's why, like Philip has talked about, apartheid free, it actually has 1,000 religious and other kinds of civic groups. Churches, mosques, JVP is a member, and it is being coordinated by the American Friends Service, but it's a profoundly interfaith effort where specific groups, like a religious congregation, take a pledge to oppose and not enable Israeli apartheid. That might mean looking at where your investment portfolio is. Is it invested in corporations that are making money off the occupation, or military industrial that are just loving Ukraine and loving the situation right now and making tremendous money?
I think Yassine has a question or a statement.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for hosting us. So I actually have a question for everyone in the room, which is, I'm a physician. I work at the hospital at Hopkins, and Israel has destroyed every hospital in Gaza. Every single hospital is no longer a hospital. And they have destroyed every major university in Gaza, and 9 out of every 10 schools are destroyed. So according to the BBC yesterday, a UN official said that we are risking a whole lost generation. No education, no professors, no teachers. We are all here talking about ceasefire, but I'm actually looking at who is responsible to build Gaza, not who Israel has the choice to negotiate with, but whose responsibility is it that through our money, that through our support, through our political and whatever thing that is happening, we have destroyed a whole swath of land with tens of thousands of people. Many of them are also injured. Very likely, many more are gonna die in the cold and in diseases, and all the writings are on the wall. So who is responsible not for ceasefire? Because the people of Gaza don't deserve the ceasefire. They don't need it. That's not what they're looking for. They want to have a respectable life like each and every one of us. So instead of just like, oh, I really want ceasefire, I feel like we're like, please, can we just sit down for a second? But if I were living in Gaza, what would I be asking the people in this room? Or what would be asking the people of America? So here's the question is, what's our responsibility actually towards the people of Gaza, towards these kids, towards the children, like my children, or your grandchildren, or your children, towards the chronically ill people, like many of us, who don't have the medications, who don't have the physicians to treat them anymore. So instead of just really being comfortable and say, I'm going to ask for the ceasefire, I'm going to be calling somebody's responsibility and say, you are responsible for this mess. You fix this mess. So this is not a comment, it's a question. Whose responsibility is it, since we are citizens of this country?
Well, obviously, the US has just provided, am I right with this?
Yeah.
An additional 14 billion for weapons, for more destruction. Now, of course, the US is complicit in this. There's just no denying it. We absolutely should ensure that we get at least that much money to provide for that. But do you really think that's going to happen? I mean, it's going to mean a huge amount of people, all of us demanding it. So we all need to get involved. And that's one way. But I would say that unfortunately, we've got to have a permanent ceasefire first. And there is a delegate to the Maryland General Assembly, Gabe Asarello, who is Asavera, excuse me, who I'm going to be meeting with in a few days, and who we are fully supporting. We hope all of you do. He's in Montgomery County, but he doesn't represent this district. But he is going to introduce a bill very soon that's for a ceasefire. He says he's going to have additional bills that support Palestinian rights and the rights of Gaza and all of those things you're talking about. So let's make sure that we try to get the rest of our representatives in the state Maryland Assembly, General Assembly, to get on board with all of his bills. That's one thing we can do. There is so much, and absolutely about boycott, divestment, and sanctions. I know that Jewish Voice for Peace is working on a new campaign about Israel bonds. It's not quite ready yet. There are numerous kinds of things, though, we can do. I have a question for you guys, and that is about this apartheid-free communities. Has your Friends meeting joined this?
Well, to be honest, we did consider it, but we haven't.
Well, then, wait a minute. About what you can do, this is the first step. This should not be.
Yeah, well,
the
maybe
people.
we'll take it up again.
Okay, you know what? The four of us want to hear about this. You guys need to join this as your first step.
Well, thank you all. I think we're.
Short question.
Okay, very short. This will have to be the last one.
There's one other too.
One of our speakers has to get to Pendle Hill tonight.
Can you give it?
Janet Bowles.
One thing that I hear in all of this, and I feel in everyone here, that the right to existence is basic. It's a basic need. And you hear it from the American Indians.
I just got a message saying
I read a book by O.C. Halliday, and I got deeply in touch with the need that Israel has to exist. And I hear it with the Palestinians, and you hear it, you hear it from anybody who's suffering or anybody who's oppressed and even the oppressors. And so my question is, you mentioned hope. And I'm wondering if all of you or those of you that feel led to speak could very briefly say, what is your hope in the short run and your hope in the long run?
And while you're thinking of that question, we have someone from the Zoom. Dorothy Wiseman.
Thank you. I know that AIPAC gives a lot of money to political politicians, you know, for their campaigns and such. Would any of you have a list of who they give money to so that we can get in touch with our politicians and tell them to stop taking the money?
I can tell you that practically all of them do. But it is available. I'm not exactly sure the best resource, but I'm sure one of us can get it to you. And I will tell you that one of the people that is considered an AIPAC boy, and I'm serious here, is David Trump.
Yeah.
We really need to make sure that David Trump does not get reelected. I mean, get elected to the Senate for Maryland. He's running, and he's considered the front runner right now. David Trump. He runs Total Wines. He is a multi billionaire. He originally was living in Virginia. He moved here to Montgomery County. He's a carpetbagger. He just kept trying to move around until he could make sure that he got to be a politician in Congress. He is already a US congressman, but he now wants to be senator. So that's one thing we can do.
Who do you support for the Democratic nomination to the Senate?
Well, the other person he's running against, I don't know as much about her. Also Brooks. And she's in PG County. I'm not sure she's that much better, but we need to check it out. That's up to us. Oh, really? You think so? Good. Oh, yeah, right. So anyway, there are things we can do like that.
You can tell them that if they have not, I was gonna say, gosh, not due to Palestine, is it Howard County for Free Palestine? They regularly post on their Instagram what each politician receives, exactly how much from AIPAC. So if you're on Instagram, maybe check that out. But I know that there's a resource online where you can actually find that information. Is all public.
I think we need to conclude, please, and I'm sure they'll be available if you want to follow up directly with them. Thank you very much. All of you.
Yeah.